Math and science, right? They're kind of a big deal. I mean, they power so much of our world.
Yeah, they really underpin everything from the tech we use to how we understand, the entire universe.
Totally. And that's why for this deep dive, we're going back in time a bit to 1989.
Ooh, retro. Okay, what happened in '89?
Well, there's this really fascinating paper by Jacobs and Wigfield that we're going to be digging into. They were looking at something that's still so relevant today, sex equity in math and science education.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we've definitely made some progress when it comes to gender equality overall, but those gaps in math and science, who's participating, how well they're doing, they're still there.
Exactly. And this research from back then gives us this really interesting historical lens to look at those persistent challenges. Like, where did these issues come from? What were the factors at play?
Yeah, good point. So for this deep dive, what are we looking at besides that main paper?
The paper itself is our main source, actually. It's a pretty comprehensive analysis of existing studies at the time, what was going on in education, and how it all connected to policy. But our mission for you today is to pull out the most important insights, make sense of it all, and understand those historical roots of sex equity issues in STEM.
STEM, you mean science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yep, all those crucial subjects. And we really want to understand those factors that we're seeing as impacting girl involvement and achievement in these fields.
Makes sense. So where do we start?
Well, let's set the stage first. Take ourselves back to the late 1980s. You'd think, with all the growing awareness of gender equality, that these educational fields would just naturally become more balanced.
Right. It seems logical.
But the paper highlights something important. There was actually already a lot of research back then showing ways to promote sex equity.
So what was the problem?
Well, the thing is, those ideas weren't really being put into practice in schools on a wide scale.
Huh. So all this knowledge, but no action.
It seems that way. And the paper actually points out a key shift in the early 80s in education reform.
Okay. What happened?
The focus shifted toward excellence. There was this idea that if you aim for higher standards for everyone, then equity would just follow naturally.
I see. But did that actually pan out?
That's the question the authors raised. Did it really work out that way? And to really see the problem they were tackling, the data from that time paints a pretty clear picture.
So what did they find?
One thing that stood out was this apparent contradiction. Girls in pre-college were actually getting better math grades than boys, but then they'd consistently score lower on the SAT math section.
Ooh, that's interesting. Like they're doing well in the classroom, but then hitting this roadblock.
Exactly. And as the National Science Foundation pointed out in 1984, that's a significant hurdle for getting into higher education, specifically in those STEM fields, and then, of course, those related careers.
Yeah, those test scores can really make a difference. But it wasn't just about test scores, right?
Right. The paper also shows some stark numbers when you look at who was actually going into those STEM fields. Back in 1985, women earned a very small percentage of doctorates in the core STEM areas. We're talking math, physics, engineering,
How small are we talking?
like 14% or even less, according to the data from that year.
Wow, that's pretty significant.
And it's interesting because when you look at the overall professional workforce, women were a much bigger part of that, around 44%. But in science and engineering, it was way lower, about 13%, based on the NSF data from '84.
So they're a significant part of the workforce in general, but seriously underrepresented in those specific areas.
Yeah. And this ties into something the authors bring up about jobs. They were looking at work from Eccles and others, and they make this really crucial point.
What's that?
They suggest that these differences in math and science preparation, the fact that girls weren't taking those higher level courses or going into those fields at the same rates, could actually limit them to certain types of jobs.
I see. So it's not just about education, it's about the potential consequences for their careers.
Exactly. Jobs that paid less, often in those traditionally female fields, which kind of perpetuates the cycle.
Right, keeping those old societal patterns in place. Okay, so the problem is pretty clear, but what were they trying to figure out with this research?
The big question they grapple with in this 1989 paper is, if researchers already knew about these effective ways to promote sex equity in math and science, why weren't those changes happening in schools?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. So how did they approach that?
Well, a big part of their analysis was looking at the dynamics between students and teachers, what they call person-centered research. How are boys and girls performing differently, and how are they interacting with their teachers?
Okay, so getting into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the classroom makes sense. What did they find there?
One really interesting thing is that when they analyzed how well boys and girls were actually doing, gender only explained a very small piece of the difference.
How small are we talking?
Like 1 to 5%, according to Lynn and Peterson's analysis in 1985.
Wow, so basically these differences they were seeing weren't really about girls being inherently worse at math or science.
Right. It wasn't about some kind of biological difference.
So if it wasn't about ability, what was it about?
Well, there were some interesting nuances. For example, in high school, boys did tend to do a bit better on those math reasoning problems, the word problems, the logic puzzles.
Those tricky ones.
But when it came to basic math skills, algebra, computation, boys and girls were pretty much equal. In fact, girls sometimes even outperformed boys in computation.
Interesting. So it's more complex than just saying boys are better at math.
Right, and it seems the differences in overall math achievement weren't really significant until around 10th grade, and even then, any advantage for boys was small.
Got it. So what about science? Was it the same kind of story?
In science, the performance differences were really tied to which courses students were taking. Girls were more likely to be in biology, less likely to be in physics.
I can see that.
The gap in chemistry seemed to be shrinking. But overall, fewer girls were completing the full high school science sequence compared to boys.
Interesting. Any ideas why that was happening?
Well, the paper suggests that the differences in underlying math skills might be playing a role, that maybe those gaps in math were carrying over into science.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like it goes beyond just the students themselves, right?
Right. The researchers also looked at the teachers, their beliefs, and how they were interacting with students. And some of the findings were pretty eye-opening.
Oh, like what?
Well, for example, Spear did this research in 1984 where teachers graded the exact same science papers, but they were told some were written by boys and some by girls.
Okay, so same work,
Yeah.
different assumed authors, and...
The teachers consistently gave higher grades to the papers they thought were written by boys.
Whoa, really? Even though the work was identical?
Yep. They rated the boys' work as being more creative, more scientifically accurate, better organized, basically better in almost every way.
Wow. That's pretty stark.
And it wasn't just a one-off finding. Later research by Spear in '87 found that teachers actually believed science education was more important for boys than girls.
Okay, so there's clearly some bias going on there, even if it's unintentional. And what about those classroom interactions? What did they find there?
Well, there was a growing body of research in those years observing what was actually happening in classrooms, and they found some concerning patterns, particularly in math and science classes. Sometimes boys were getting more instructional time, more encouragement, more detailed feedback.
And were girls getting less of those things?
It seems so, and high-achieving boys were even getting more praise from teachers and having more interactions with them compared to high-achieving girls.
So even when they were excelling, girls weren't getting the same level of attention.
Yeah. And Fenema, one of the researchers mentioned in the paper, suggested that these subtle differences, even if unintentional, could actually lead boys to become more independent learners and develop better problem-solving skills in math.
That makes sense. Like they're being given more space to figure things out on their own.
Yeah.
So what about in science classrooms where there's similar patterns?
Very similar. Crossman's research in '87 found that teachers, both male and female, interacted more with boys than girls in both biology and physics.
Huh. So across different subjects. And you said both male and female teachers.
Yes, but what's really interesting is that this effect was even stronger with female teachers.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think they'd be more aware of these biases.
You'd think so. And the paper does emphasize that this wasn't true of all teachers, but the fact that it was happening at all was significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even when teachers are trying to treat everyone equally, there's this other layer to consider.
What's that?
Well, research suggests that boys and girls might actually interpret those interactions differently, even if the teacher's actions are the same.
Oh, that's a good point. So the same words or gestures from a teacher could mean different things depending on whether the student is a boy or a girl.
Exactly. And that's something Stanek and Reyes, along with the Bussard, highlighted in their work.
It's fascinating how much nuance there is to these dynamics, and it's not just about individual interactions either. The paper talks about how much gender was used to categorize and organize things, especially in elementary schools.
What do you mean?
Well, Buswell's research in 1981 found that teachers were making gender classifications about 20 times a day.
Wow, 20 times a day. That's a lot.
It is. And it shows how deeply ingrained these gender divisions can be, even in seemingly small things.
Absolutely. Okay, so beyond those direct interactions, what else did they look at?
They also focused on the role of mentors and role models and how important they are. Seeing women in math and science, whether as teachers, professionals, or even historical figures, was shown to potentially encourage more girls to participate.
Makes sense. Like if she can do it, maybe I can too.
Exactly. And having those supportive mentors was seen as really crucial as well. And all of this, the subtle biases, the presence or absence of support, all of that ultimately affected student self-efficacy.
Self-efficacy, that's like their belief in their own abilities, right?
Yeah. Specifically, their confidence in their ability to succeed in math and science. Research by Betts and Hackett in '83 found a strong link between math self-efficacy and whether someone chose a science-based major in college. And later research showed how much self-efficacy influences the choices students make, particularly girls.
So it's not just about being good at math or science. It's about believing you can be good at it.
Right. And all of these factors we've been talking about, the classroom dynamics, the role models, the messages they're getting, all of that contributes to that sense of self-efficacy.
It all adds up.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about those individual interactions, but what about the bigger picture?
That's where we move from those person-centered factors to what the paper calls the instructional context. Things like the learning materials, how testing is done, and the overall environment.
Okay, so zooming out a bit.
One key aspect here is the potential impact of sex-biased learning materials. Research by Scott and Shao suggested that exposure to those kinds of materials, especially in early elementary school, could actually strengthen traditional gender stereotypes.
How so?
Well, if kids are constantly seeing math and science presented as male domains, it could unintentionally make girls less interested.
Right, like it reinforces that idea that this isn't for me.
Exactly. And Kelly in 1987 observed that this wasn't just a US thing. Worldwide, more males were depicted in science roles, in textbooks, everywhere.
So it's this pervasive message.
Right. And then you have the issue of bias in educational testing.
Oh, right, like those standardized tests.
Yeah. While a lot of research at the time was looking at bias related to race and ethnicity, some studies also looked at how certain types of test questions might put girls at a disadvantage.
Interesting, like what kind of questions?
Questions that were based on experiences or roles that were traditionally seen as male. And those kinds of questions could lead to girls scoring lower, even if they understood the underlying concepts.
I see. So it's not just about knowing the material, it's about how the questions are framed.
And the paper points out that doing poorly on these standardized tests could then discourage girls from continuing in math and science.
Yeah, that makes sense. It can be really demoralizing to feel like you're not good at something, especially when it comes to tests.
Absolutely. And beyond the materials and the tests themselves, how the information is presented in the classroom also seems to make a big difference.
Okay, so how does that play in?
Well, the paper highlights this project in England called the Girls into Science and Technology Project, GIS for short. They found that choosing topics that were equally interesting to girls and boys made a big difference in engagement.
So it's about making the subject matter relevant and engaging for everyone.
Right. And they even had success connecting science concepts to more caring topics, which really resonated with the girls.
That's a cool approach. So it sounds like the learning environment itself, the overall vibe of the classroom is a factor as well.
Absolutely. Research by Delamont back in 1980 found examples of teachers using competition between boys and girls, or even separating them for activities as a way to motivate them.
And did that work?
Well, the research suggests it might actually be counterproductive. Ames's work in '84 suggested that those approaches could reinforce stereotypes and actually make girls less motivated, especially in math.
I can see that. Like, if you're constantly being told you're competing against the boys, it can create this sense of us versus them.
And it's not just about overt competition, even the general atmosphere matters. Eccles and her colleagues in '86 found that girls had much more positive attitudes towards math in classrooms where there was less emphasis on competition, less comparing students to each other, more cooperation, and where teachers were seen as being fair.
So a more collaborative and supportive environment.
Yeah. And Peterson and Fenema found that cooperation actually helped girls perform better in math as well.
Makes sense. And it's interesting how even little things, like how the classroom is physically arranged, can have an impact.
Right. Sadker and Sadker, in their research in '86, observed that in classrooms where boys and girls were sitting in separate sections, teachers tended to spend more time with the boys' sections.
Wow, really? Even something as simple as where they sit can make a difference.
It seems so. And another thing the paper highlights is the timing of school transitions. those big changes like moving from elementary to middle school,
Yeah, those can be tough.
especially during early adolescence. Research on gender role development, like Hill and Lynch's work in '83, suggests that this is a time when kids become much more aware of those roles and the expectations that come with them. And for girls, who often start puberty earlier than boys, that pressure to conform to what they perceive as female roles might be especially strong.
Oh, I can see that. Like they're dealing with all these physical and social changes, and now they're also making decisions about their academic future.
Right. And those decisions might be influenced by all these messages they're receiving about what girls should be interested in. And unfortunately, that often doesn't include math and science.
Right, it's seen as more of a boy thing.
And the research actually shows that negative attitudes towards math increased for girls during those junior high years. And Smith's research in '84 found something interesting. Having separate science classes for girls during these transition periods could actually have a positive effect on their attitudes and how well they did.
Huh. So maybe that temporary separation allowed them to explore those subjects without those gendered pressures.
That's one interpretation, and it all comes back to how many different factors are at play here. It's not just about individual talent, it's about the environment, the messages they're getting, the support they're receiving or not receiving.
Totally. It's this whole ecosystem of influences. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What's next?
Well, now we move to what the paper calls macro-level demographic research.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It's basically looking at the bigger picture, who's enrolling in what courses, and ultimately what kind of careers they're choosing.
So zooming out even further, got it.
And this part of the paper tackles a pretty interesting contradiction that was prominent in the research at the time. Remember how we talked about girls getting better math grades in high school but then scoring lower on the SAT?
Yeah, that was weird.
Well, researchers were trying to figure out what was going on there, and when they looked at course enrollment, the findings were a bit mixed. Some data, like Armstrong's analysis in 1980, suggested that boys and girls were taking most high school math courses at about the same rate, except for those very advanced levels like calculus.
So similar participation overall, but maybe dropping off at the highest level.
It seemed that way. But other research painted a slightly different picture. Chipman and colleagues, in '85, found that enrollment in those advanced high school math courses was still significantly higher for boys.
So maybe those earlier findings were a bit too optimistic.
Perhaps. And Weston Gross, in '86, also found that boys were more likely to have taken higher-level math by their junior year. So maybe those disparities were becoming more apparent later in high school.
Got it. And what about in science?
The trends in science were similar. While boys and girls were taking roughly the same number of years of science, females were more concentrated in life sciences, while males were more likely to take both life and physical sciences.
So kind of sticking to those more traditional gender roles.
It seemed that way, and it's important to note that the paper pointed out that not all states were keeping detailed records of course enrollment broken down by specific classes.
So it's hard to get a completely accurate picture.
Right, but some investigations at the state level, like in California and Michigan, did show some differences between boys and girls, even in taking courses at intermediate levels, like algebra the second.
So even before those advanced courses, those gaps might have already been there.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really crucial part of the paper, how those research findings were actually being used to inform policy and practice back in the late 1980s.
Okay, so how did research actually translate into real-world changes?
Well, the authors emphasize that policy happens at different levels, from the federal government down to what happens in individual schools and classrooms.
Right, so it's this multi-layered system.
Exactly. And the paper gives some interesting examples of programs that were trying to bridge that gap between research and practice at those different levels. At the regional level, you had initiatives like the Planned Change model in Michigan. They used research on things like those student-teacher interactions and the learning environment to work with school districts on implementing changes.
So taking that research and turning it into actionable steps.
Yeah. And at the state level, there were organizations like the California Coalition for Sex Equity in Education. They were funded by the Women's Educational Equity Act, and they used research findings, along with ideas from social psychology and business management, to develop and implement equity programs in schools.
It sounds like a pretty comprehensive approach.
It was, and Michigan also had its on-site long-range planning model, which focused on getting people at the local school district level involved in planning for those long-term changes.
So really grassroots efforts.
And it seems like research had the most direct impact at the level of individual school districts and schools.
What kind of initiatives were happening there?
All sorts of things, from encouraging more women to take on leadership roles in schools to being more mindful about choosing curriculum materials that weren't biased to providing training for teachers.
So addressing those biases we talked about earlier.
Exactly. A great example is Project Equal S in California. It was a teacher training program that focused on making teachers aware of those potential biases and how they were interacting with students and giving them tools and strategies to create a more equitable classroom.
That's so important. And did it work?
Well, Sadker and Sadker, they were doing similar teacher training programs across different grade levels, and they saw some positive changes in how teachers and students interacted.
That's encouraging.
It is. And there were also programs aimed at school principals, like the Principal Effectiveness Pupil Achievement Project. That program tried to equip principals with the skills to lead school-wide efforts to make teaching more equitable for all students.
Interesting. So empowering those in leadership positions to make a difference.
Exactly. And a lot of programs at the school level incorporated that research on role models. The Konitz program at the University of Kansas, for example, gave students opportunities to interact with female scientists in various ways.
That's a great way to expose them to those positive examples.
And the Academy in Mentoring at Eastern Michigan University took a different approach. They trained teachers and counselors to be mentors for high-achieving girls in STEM fields.
That's awesome. Like having someone to guide them and encourage them.
Right. And the GEAST project in England, which we talked about earlier, is another great example of taking research on how to present information in a more engaging way for girls and putting it into action.
So it seems like a lot of positive things were happening. But the paper also talks about some challenges, right?
Yes. Despite all these efforts, the authors point out that many researchers felt like their findings weren't being used as much as they could be.
So what was holding things back?
One key reason they mention is that researchers often didn't really understand how policy worked.
I see. Like they had all this valuable knowledge, but didn't know how to navigate the system to get it implemented.
Exactly. And even when research was applied, it often seemed to be at the level of federal or state laws, rather than trickling down to those individual school districts and classrooms where it could have a more direct impact.
Right. So it's about bridging that gap between the big picture and the day-to-day reality in schools.
And often, researchers didn't even know if or how their findings were being used.
So a lack of communication and feedback loops.
Definitely. And another big challenge was funding. There just wasn't a lot of money available to support those sex equity programs.
Oh, that's always a problem, isn't it?
It is. And the authors also found that a lot of these programs weren't very well coordinated. Different groups might be doing similar things without knowing about each other's efforts.
So a lot of potential for wasted effort and resources.
Exactly. And importantly, there weren't many good evaluations being done to really assess how effective these different initiatives were.
Oh, that's key. If you don't know what's working, you can't improve it.
Right. And perhaps most concerning was that a lot of these programs only served school districts that actively sought them out.
So the districts that already had some awareness and motivation.
Exactly. And that meant the districts that might have needed them the most weren't being reached. And the authors linked this to weak enforcement of Title IX and a general lack of prioritization of sex equity.
So it's not just about having programs available. It's about making sure they're reaching those who need them most.
And to address these challenges, the paper laid out some pretty concrete recommendations for policy changes back in 1989. At the state level, they suggested things like increasing the number of required courses in math, science, and computers, making sure achievement tests were fair for all genders, and requiring teachers to have training on sex and race equity.
So really trying to bake equity into the system at a foundational level.
Yeah. And for school districts and individual schools, they recommended thinking more carefully about when those big school transitions happen, choosing instructional materials that weren't biased, making sure career counseling included information about non-stereotypical careers, and providing more support for Title IX coordinators.
So really addressing those different layers we've talked about. And what about research? What did they suggest for future research?
They called for more focused studies on those key areas we discussed: the student-teacher interactions, the learning environment, how information is presented.
So building on what they already knew.
Right. And they also emphasized the need to pay more attention to demographic trends, who's taking what courses, who's going into what fields, and to do more rigorous evaluations of how well these programs were actually working.
Makes sense. You need that data to see if you're making progress. And they talked about communication being a problem, right?
They did. They stressed that researchers needed to find better ways to share their findings with policymakers.
So getting that research out of the ivory tower and into the hands of the people who can actually make changes.
Exactly. And they suggested doing things like creating clear summaries of research findings, giving feedback to the schools that participate in their research, getting involved in decisions about curriculum and testing, even working with textbook companies and the media.
Wow, so a multi-pronged approach to really getting the word out.
They also suggested making better use of existing organizations and resources groups like the Women's Educational Equity Act Publishing Center, programs within the AAAS, and the American Educational Research Association.
So tapping into those networks that were already there.
Yeah. They even proposed the idea of creating a central clearinghouse for research on equity, a place where people could easily find that information.
That would be so useful.
And ultimately, they stressed the importance of closer collaboration between researchers and policymakers at all levels.
So breaking down those silos and working together towards a common goal.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into this fascinating 1989 paper, it's striking how relevant a lot of these findings and recommendations still are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though it's been over 3 decades, we're still grappling with a lot of the same issues.
We've seen how those issues around sex equity and STEM education are complex, influenced by so many factors. The subtle ways teachers and students interact, the design of learning materials, those broader societal expectations, policy decisions, it's all connected.
And even though it's just a snapshot in time, this research really highlights that ongoings need to be aware of potential biases to create those supportive and inclusive learning environments and to actively work on connecting what we know from research with what's actually happening in our schools.
It's a good reminder that progress takes time, and it takes effort from a lot of different people. And here's something to think about as we finish up. Consider all the changes that have happened since 1989. The huge growth in technology, the impact of social media, and how our understanding of gender has evolved. How might those shifts have changed, or maybe even reinforced those patterns we've been talking about in STEM education and career paths?
That's a great question. It makes you wonder how much progress we've really made and what still needs to change.
And as we move forward, it's important to reflect on those current efforts to make STEM more equitable and to think critically about how effective they are in light of these historical insights.
So taking those lessons from the past and using them to shape a more equitable future.
Exactly. And if this deep dive has sparked your interest, we encourage you to explore the current research on equity in STEM and think about how you, in your own way, might contribute to creating a future that's more inclusive and fair for everyone in these vital fields.
Because ultimately, everyone deserves the opportunity to succeed in STEM, regardless of gender.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe the next generation of researchers will look back at our time and see how far we've come.
Fingers crossed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.